good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you are. I'm Will Krebs from Project Lead the Way, and I will be talking today about Perkins V, the federal CTE legislation, and sharing some updates and opportunities with you all. Like I said, my name is Will Krebs, and I'm the Vice President of Policy and Government Relations for Project Lead the Way. I'm guessing since you're all here at a Solid Professor workshop and having seen some of the chat window for the entire session, most of you are familiar with PLTW. If you're not, I recommend you check us out on our website, pltw.org. A little bit about us. We are the nation's leading provider of problem-based, hands-on career learning in classroom curriculum for grades pre-K through 12, oriented around computer science, biomedical science, and engineering. We currently have over 4 million students enrolled in our courses across the country, and we're all in all 50 states. So hopefully you've come across us and have had a good experience. I'm going to try a feature here, and I would love to know a little bit more about who's in the audience. Like I said, we're talking about federal legislation, which is a very, very broad topic. And so this will be helpful for me if we can pull this off to know a little bit about you all. So I'm going to launch a poll. And if you could please tell me what role you're in. If you're a high school teacher, middle school teacher, building admin, district, higher ed, or other. So I'll give folks a minute to complete that poll so I have a better idea of who I'm talking with. While you're doing that, I'll give myself a plug, and you see my Twitter handle there. Follow me for some breaking and exciting education policy developments and or Kansas City Chiefs, Kansas City Royals updates, as those are my teams. All right, I will try to close the poll. Okay, I think you all can see those results. I'll share them with you. It looks like 40% of you are high school teachers, 20% middle school teachers. Okay, results are still coming in. That's awesome. Live data. So big chunk of high school folks, couple higher ed folks. That always makes the room interesting, and a handful of other. I wish I could learn more about what it is you do, but great. And it doesn't look like we have any building or district admins, and that's okay. So I will focus on thinking about this from the perspective of mostly high school and middle school teachers, but certainly I expect that hopefully all of you will take something away from this conversation. Thank you for indulging me that. Our agenda for the day, we'll start with introductions, which we've just done. I'll give a high-level overview of the Carl D. Perkins Law, this piece of federal legislation that is so very important to all of us in the CTE space. Highlight a few key opportunities that will likely be relevant to you all. Then we'll talk about how states and districts are actually implementing this federal legislation. And then I'll wrap, certainly top of mind, and very, very important. I've added some content here about how the current environment and the challenges we're facing related to the pandemic of COVID-19 is affecting Perkins V implementation. Obviously, this is content will be relevant to everything we talk about today, and it's moving quickly, and so there will be a lot of unanswered questions, but I do want to try to address some thinking here. And then there is, I saw in the chat, an opportunity, any Q&A you have. I will be keeping an eye on this. Oh, thank you, Stephen, pointing out that you're from the Southern Oklahoma Tech Center. I suspect you were one of those other responses. Thank you for filling that in for me. And Matt, yes, Mahomes all day. And so we will have some time for discussion. I'll keep an eye on the chat. So if there are some questions about specific things as they come up, I'll do my best to address them. If not, we've got some time at the end. I'll scroll through the Q&A and try to address your thoughts. Big picture objective for us today really is to try to help everybody in the room develop a better understanding of the federal CTE law for the sake of advocating for yourself, your students, your classrooms, and your programs. Really, whatever level you are, hopefully that objective hits home, and hopefully at the end of this we can have checked that box and met it. A little bit about our partnership, Project Lead the Way. I gave you a quick description of what we're all about. We do have a formal long-term, very valuable partnership with Solid Professor. As the official training partner for PLTW, you see here a screenshot. A lot of our professional development, how these opportunities take shape, runs through Solid Professor, and Solid Professor has a vast library of other professional development and learning opportunities that PLTW teachers have access to through the partnerships we have with the organization. So of course, thanks to Solid Professor for that valuable partnership and for hosting everybody here today. So let's start with a little bit of an overview with federal funding. I'm going to do another poll. Simple question, best guess. If you could let me know what your best guess is for the percentage of total education funding, all the money that comes into your building, into your district to educate students, provide all those services, the whole kit and caboodle. What percentage of that do you believe comes from federal sources, all federal sources? If you had to take your best guess, what percentage would you say? Typically when I do this in person, I get to call on people, but this is great because now I'll get everybody's feedback and see if we have a consensus. Live data coming in. I've got 11 responses. We'll leave that open and I won't share the answer for a moment here. About 15 seconds before I close the poll. Awesome. All right, I'm gonna close this off. Very interesting. We've got 50%, 10 of you responded with 40% of total funding coming from the feds. 25% of you, 5 of you suggested 25%. That's convenient how that worked out. Same here, 10% of you, 2 of you guessed 10% coming from the feds, and 15% said 5%. So we do have consensus, 50% of you thinking 40%, but few people all over the place. If I had something to give to the winners, I would be giving it to those of you who selected 10%. So here's the pie chart. This does vary state by state, but on average, and the range is pretty tight. The range is only about 8% to 12%. On average, though, about 10% of funding comes from federal sources. And here I'm talking the title funding. I'm talking money for special education. I'm talking money for career and tech ed, which is what we're talking about today. But as you can see from this breakdown, the vast, vast, vast majority comes from either state or local. So, and I won't get into the breakdown of property taxes, all this, that, and the other. But for the most part, as you can see here, not a lot comes from the federal government, which is interesting. And given the results of our poll, that's typically what I hear when I ask people the question, that there's an assumption that it's much greater than 10%. In part because education finance can be tricky to wrap our heads around generally. However, I think part of the reason people tend to think that the percentage is so much higher than it actually is has to do with what we're talking about today, which is the policy frameworks that the feds put in place that are attached to the funding. So with title funding, with special ed funding, with CTE funding, oftentimes there are a lot of strings attached that states and districts need to pull in order to access the funding. And therefore, the dollar amount has an outsized effect on how we operate in K-12 schools, especially because of all of those policy strings. So starting with that, what I want to be clear with, what I'm talking about today is only the federal Perkins CTE law. So there are going to be some times where I say you can spend money on this or you can't spend money on that. You might be thinking to yourself, now, wait a minute, I've seen money spent on that in my building. You very well might have, but that is probably because the money being spent is separate money from what we're describing today. So please keep that in mind. Okay, so the Carl D. Perkins Act, what is this thing all about? So Perkins V, which is what we're talking about, was signed into law on July 31, 2018, replacing Perkins IV. Perkins, the law itself, even before it was called that, in some iteration has been around for over 100 years. The federal government has been involved with funding what we now refer to as career and technical education, or CTE. At times it's been referred to as vocational education, or voc ed. There are also some adult learning aspects or higher ed learning aspects here related to community colleges. This iteration of the law is relatively new, but the policy itself is like I said, the feds have been funding career and tech ed for over 100 years. This is the primary way through which money is allocated from federal coffers to states, to districts, for the sake of career and tech ed. Most of you are likely familiar, I've mentioned this a couple times, Title I funding, Title II funding. There is other funding, other legislative laws in effect that govern that, but we're just looking at the Perkins Act today. And essentially what this looks like is states receive the money, and then they distribute those funds to secondary programs and post-secondary programs while retaining some portion of the money to implement the grant. And all of this is based on the numbers of school-age students in the state that is receiving the funds. That's how the amount is calculated. And this money flows to states in what are called basic state grants. These are 4-year, and we'll talk about these plans. A state puts in place a 4-year plan, and then every year they receive their cut of Perkins funds to distribute out to schools and secondary schools and post-secondary schools. Perkins V was reauthorized in, as I mentioned, July of 2018. However, it was due for reauthorization. So Perkins IV was written Perkins IV was put into place in 2006 and was due for reauthorization in 2012. They were a little tardy, 6 years tardy on the reauthorization. And there are two important points I want to make in thinking about this timeline. First, this idea, Perkins IV, and remember, this is the primary CTE law in the country, was in place from 2006 to 2018, 12 years. So think about it, an entire cohort of students entered into our public schools and then exited our K-12 public schools over the life cycle of Perkins IV. But also imagine this, that when Perkins IV, the country's CTE law, was put into place in 2006, just think about what we're doing right now. Think about, I always tell people when I give this presentation in Perkins in person that I wouldn't have to worry about somebody pulling out their smartphone, taking an unflattering picture of me and putting it on Twitter, because in 2006, none of those things existed. So we had a law in place that is supposed to help states understand how to prepare students for career that saw the evolution of our economy that occurred so rapidly and so profoundly. It really is something to think about that. And so thankfully now we have this new piece of legislation, this new law that is in place that is different, but that will govern what this looks like moving forward. When Perkins V was reauthorized, that covers up until fiscal year 2024, at which point it will be up for reauthorization. Now, as we saw in the previous slide, they might not reauthorize it in 2024, but good news, bad news here. Good news, bad news for y'all here. So the good news, when you look at this slide, you can see that over time, prior to 2016, other than to adjust for inflation, there really hadn't been much of an increase as to how much money was being made available for CTE through Perkins in this country. However, with Perkins V, you can see that the authorization cap was raised all the way up to $1.3 billion, a significant amount of money and a significant increase year over year. That's the good news. That tells us, that policymakers in DC believe in CTE and believe in the work that's being done in this space. Now, the bad news, you can see from my slide that 2019 was allocated at $1.2 billion. 2024 was authorized for spending up to 1.3. Just because it's authorized doesn't mean that it's allocated. There's a very important difference between those two. And I've got to tell you, when I'd give this presentation last summer, and all signs pointed to hitting that authorization cap, that money would be made available. As you all know, the world has changed significantly in the last several months, and I would guess now it would be much harder to see. CTE advocates are going to have to fight to just sustain funding here, given how much money has decreases in revenue, the hit to the economy we've seen, but also the amount of money that has needed to be authorized through stimulus funding. So just looking at this, the political side of all of this, if you will, a couple key takeaways. First, strong bipartisan support for CTE. I've talked to politicians, one of whom in my mind, I remember he told me CTE is like the Switzerland of education politics. It's safe for everybody. One of the things we've seen with Perkins V is that the role of the federal government has been significantly reduced. And we'll talk about the specifics of that later, but that was a response to what some considered to be overreach of the federal government, really between, 2000 on up to about 2016. For those of you who are familiar with some of the nuts and bolts of Perkins, of Title I, no curveballs for you. That the funding formula, et cetera, very few changes. In terms of policy making, very smart move here. With Perkins V, there's just stronger alignment with ESSA, the Every Student Succeeds Act, and WIOA, the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. Those are the three of the four main education laws at the federal level. And believe it or not, and some of you likely dealt with this, that under No Child Left Behind and Perkins 4, you would have things like one law would define a graduate one way and the other law would define it another way. And so you had these weird disconnects between the two laws, which is no longer the case. And that's just good, smart policymaking. And then lastly, I quipped earlier about the length of time Perkins 4 had been in effect and the changes to the economy. Well, Perkins 5 was written in a way to do more to recognize the speed with which the economy can change. And so there's language in there that helps states and districts pivot more quickly if and when the economy changes. And we'll talk about those specifics as we move on. As we go into key opportunities, checking the chat, clicking on all these fancy windows, seeing a couple questions. Oh boy, I got a question here from Boston Public. And Bruce, we're going to have to talk offline because I will tell you, Massachusetts has some of the most complicated funding laws in terms of CTE, non-CTE, et cetera, that really exists anywhere. And so it is very, very tricky. I'd need to know more about your school, more about where your school is, all sorts of things. So that one's tricky. We'll have to talk about that. And then Danielle, I see yours, but I'm going to save that one for the end. Keep the questions coming. Thank you. Yeah, Bruce, you won't be smiling once we talk through it. It is I have nightmares about, what is it, chapter 49 schools, chapter 36 schools, something like that. Okay, key opportunities in Perkins 5. Some significant changes here in the law that I think are quite exciting. Hopefully you guys are excited about all this too. So let's take a look. So the first is Perkins 5 does a fantastic job of, in my opinion, of requiring states, districts, and schools to really engage with the students they serve, with the teachers they employ, and the parents and community members that really make the school go. And so I pulled a quote here, and this appears a number of times in the actual law, where you see it requires representatives of CTE programs in a local education agency, that's the fancy way of saying a school district, including teachers and other faculty. So essentially, if you are a teacher, and especially if you're a career and tech ed teacher, the law requires that when districts write their applications and when states write their plans, that You have a seat at the table. This is not a should, this is think about, this is required that representatives of CTE programs, including teachers and other faculty, have a voice in the process of writing this plan. This is very, very important in one of my key takeaways. And truly, if you forget everything else that you hear from me this afternoon, the one thing that I would ask you to remember is be involved in the planning process. Ask yourself, if you're not involved in the conversation, who is going to be there advocating on behalf of your students? I typically, again, when we're in person, I ask folks to raise their hand if the state superintendent has called you personally and invited you to sit on a committee to develop a plan. Very few hands go up, if any. I'll ask the same question for district superintendents. How many of you have gotten that phone call from your superintendent asking you to participate? Very few hands go up. I'll tell you, I've been on the other side. I've worked for state departments of ed. I've talked to superintendents about this. They love it when you reach out and say, hey, if you need a CTE teacher, if you want somebody to be involved, I'm your person. So really, this is about advocating for yourself, advocating for your students. The law gives you a seat at the table. Advocate to take that seat. So that's number one. This is a very important part of the law, a very important change. So I would certainly recommend that we'll talk about district plans, we'll talk about state plans, find out who is at that table and try to get yourself that seat if you can. Melissa's asking, even middle school teachers specifically are not required by law to have that seat at the table. However, middle school teachers can certainly count as a representative of a CTE program. So district isn't required to ask you. However, if they do, that would satisfy this requirement. And with that, that's a good transition. Let's talk about middle school. So I gave my poll earlier, and I know I've got some middle school teachers in the room. So hopefully this is going to be exciting information for you. So under Perkins 4, the law was written to say that funds could go down to students as low as grade 7, but the law was written in a way as to say that if funds are going down to grade 7, those 7th graders really could only be participating in secondary programs. So basically, you'd have opportunities to bring up your 7th graders, 8th graders into like a freshman class, or to take that same content and push it down to 7th graders, maybe do some really basic career awareness, things like that. Perkins 5, however, and this is a big win, pushes that limit all the way down to grade 5 and changes the language around middle grades implementation. So now you can really truly implement a robust middle grades 5 through 8 program, CTE program, with Perkins 5 funding. Obviously, that's a win for getting content down to middle schoolers, which is really important sooner in a more comprehensive way. But just from a procedural point of view, I would oftentimes hear from administrators, building administrators, CTE directors, and they would even hesitate to use Perkins 4 money for grades 7 and 8 because there was always the risk of, well, what happens if a 6th grader, enrolls, or we bought this equipment and it's sitting in the middle school and now 6th graders are using it, just compliance headaches that didn't need to be there. So this is an absolute win to get more opportunity for middle grades into really fun, robust programs. Of course, I'm biased. I work for Project Lead the Way. So I would point out that this is a great opportunity for Project Lead the Way programs that you can, if you haven't already thought about implementing a gateway program, that's our middle grades program, or expanding your middle grades program. Certainly there's an opportunity through Perkins 5 to do exactly that. Moving ahead, another key opportunity in Perkins 5 relates to professional development. This is one of the primary uses of Perkins funding, is providing professional development and other training for CTE teachers. Again, in person, I typically ask the question of, I give this presentation at Project Lead the Way Summit. I give it at a variety of other conferences across the country throughout the year. And I will always ask teachers, raise your hand if you know you paid either for registration or some other aspect of attending the professional development with Perkins funds. And without fail, I usually get about 50% of hands that go up. So that's good news. The change with Perkins 5 is there is now even more flexibility with what counts as professional development and acceptable uses of funds. There are 9 of them here. I am not a lawyer, so I can't say this definitively, but I've never had anybody push back on me. When you look at these 9, and I won't read through them, I think you'd be really hard pressed to find a quality professional development opportunity that doesn't fit into at least one of these 9 categories. These are all really pretty broad. For example, number 1, advanced knowledge of pedagogical practices. I think you can find a lot that would fit in there. So that's all very good news. I do want to call out, I am a former special education teacher. I love seeing in here developing appropriate accommodations for students with disabilities. This is a bit of an aside, but Perkins 5 has done a really good job, in my opinion, of contemplating how do we ensure that career and tech ed can be accessed for every student, students in special ed, students who are English language learners, students who are at risk. It's just a smart law, in my opinion, in that regard. So consider Perkins funds for PLTW training, for other training that you might be accessing through Solid Professor, or really if there are good opportunities that you think would help you become a better teacher, truly they should be accessible to you through funding through Perkins 5. Okay, this is by far the wonkiest, most in the weeds aspect of the presentation here. I'm going to talk about programs of study. And I'm going to talk about accountability and some measurement of some things. So essentially the way the law works is this, that the federal government is saying we are going to pay for states and districts to implement education programs that prepare students for success in their careers. And they ask states to ensure that districts are putting kids through what is called a program of study. This program of study becomes a very, very important concept in how the law operates. And it's essentially to ensure, you see the definition here, it is a coordinated, non-duplicative sequence of academic and technical content that ... addresses these things. The feds want to make sure that we're not just throwing things at the wall here when we think about preparing students for future careers. And I describe these programs of study as, think of it as an on-ramp, that you start broad with introductory content, and then every year as the student progresses through this program of study, the content both gets more specific in terms of the career that it's preparing the student for, but also more rigorous in terms of how difficult the content is to master. So that's a program of study. The other very important definition here is CTE concentrator. And a CTE concentrator is defined as a student who completes at least 2 courses in a single program of study. So imagine, right, you might have a program of study for, let's say computer science. You have a computer science program of study, and you start out as a freshman and you take an introductory computer science A course, and then as a sophomore you take a CSP, a computer science principles course. Now all of a sudden, because you've taken those 2 courses, they're coordinated, non-duplicative, and they're in a sequence, you are considered a CTE concentrator per the federal law. Okay, so those are the building blocks of the federal law. I do want to point out here, and I get questions around this a lot, well, which courses can we include in a program of study? That's a state and local decision. The federal government, in its infinite wisdom, does not define what courses go into these programs of study. It's about 50-50 split in terms, about half of states at the state level, they define what a program of study looks like. And the other half, they allow the district to define it based on some criteria, that the courses have to be this, that, and the other. But it's a state and district decision about which courses can fit. I always emphasize 2 things here. 1, Project Lead the Way courses at any level in any of our courses are good fits, really worthy of consideration for most, if not all, programs of study. So really consider, if you have a PLTW program, consider that as an option within your program of study. The other question I frequently get here has to do with industry certifications and credentialing. As you see in the definition, a program of study does need to allow the opportunity for the student to earn an industry credential or a dual credit or some other sort of post-secondary credential recognition. The way I describe this is it does not have to be, not every course in the program of study needs to have an industry credential. Instead, the program needs to have multiple off-ramps that include an industry credential or dual credit. So you might have, that sophomore, and I think this is smart, that think about if that were the requirement, your freshman, having taken one CTE course, would be on the hook to sit for an industry credential. And that just wouldn't be good for kids. There aren't industry credentials that exist out there that a freshman in high school can earn that are really going to make a meaningful difference for him or her once they get to their career. It might be an indicator that they're on the right path, but it's not going to open a ton of doors. So the idea is not that every course in the program of study culminate with an industry credential. It's just that the program of study has off-ramps. I'm sure I'll get some questions about that. It's a little complicated, but hopefully that provides a little bit more information. Okay, staying on this theme, should make everybody feel good that when the federal government sends out money to states that there are some accountability hooks in it. And this is the way it works with Perkins V. First, for those of you who have worked with this sort of thing before, you're probably familiar with performance targets. These are essentially the manner in which the state says, we expect CTE concentrators, remember that term, to perform at a certain level on various indicators. In the past, that conversation was a negotiation between the state and the federal government. The state might say, we expect 30% of CTE concentrators to graduate from high school, and the feds are going to say, no way, that's too low. We got to see you up at 50, 60, 70% before we approve your plan. That is no longer the case. There's no longer the need to negotiate. Now the decision is entirely up to the state in terms of what the performance indicators are going to be. Keep that in mind and go back to what I said about 20 minutes ago, that the number one thing I want you to take from this call is the importance of you advocating for yourself and advocating for your students. Because there's no longer this negotiation, states are going to need some help to set good performance targets, both in the sense of you don't want to overshoot it and set unreasonable expectations, but you also certainly don't want to undershoot it and have a bar that is too low. So keep that in mind, that this accountability system for the law is based on how CTE concentrators do on a variety of things, and that decision is entirely up to the state. Here are the variables that can be factored in based on how well CTE concentrators do. And so essentially at the end of the year, your district, your state create these data reports that will show how well did CTE concentrators do on things like graduation rates. Academic proficiency is measured by end of course state exams, etc. So lots to go in there, just being conscious of time. I'm not going to go into too many more additional details. I will point out that I said at the top that Perkins V gives more flexibility to states and pulls some responsibilities away from the feds. One of the ways in which they do that are these last two bullet points, that the state can add in other measures of CTE quality that are completely up to them. We have already seen states that use Project Lead the Way's end of course assessments in these reports. I expect that will continue, but these could be other things, industry certifications, dual credit, other sorts of assessments. I'm going to pause here and just take a look. All right. Some good questions. Keep them coming. So Christopher is asking, what about this program of study credential when students switch paths? So let me go back a couple slides here. Oops. It's a great question. So in terms of the concentrator definition, the courses need to be in the same program of study. So if a student jumps from, let's say, computer science as a freshman and says, this is not for me, I'm going to go over to health and human services and really, shift gears, then that student would still need to take 2 courses in the Health and Human Services program of study in order to be deemed a concentrator. In terms of the credential, you can take the credential at any point in time along the program of study. So theoretically, again, let's have the hypothetical. Freshman takes a computer science course, doesn't like it, hops over to that as a sophomore to a health and human science course, and feels like, what, there actually is, it's called the BASE, it's a lab assistant industry credential that is pretty heavy on biology and lab skills. And so maybe the sophomore has also taken Bio 1 and is in Bio 2 and says, you know what, I'm ready to sit for this exam. They could go ahead and do so. And they might pass and earn that credential as a sophomore without being a CTE concentrator. That's fine. But it's not until they complete that second course that they would then be deemed a CTE concentrator. So really the effect would have to do with what data is reported and how that is considered. So hopefully that answers your question, Christopher. All right, talked about accountability. Last opportunity I want to highlight here is the law just does a better job of aligning itself with industry needs. And it does this a couple ways. First, under Perkins 4, states submitted 6-year plans and districts only had to submit information on a 4-year cycle. Both of those have been cut down. And so now states submit a 4-year plan and districts have to do a needs assessment every 2 years. And so this ensures that the plans aren't as stale, gives folks opportunities to react to data a little bit more quickly, which is good. Another way, and this is probably my second favorite feature of Perkins 5, Perkins 4 talked about 2 things: academic skills and technical skills. So academic skills being, the math and science associated with being successful in an engineering career, and the technical skills being the very specific skills that you would need to be successful on the factory floor. Perkins 5 includes those 2 as well, but adds in a third. And the law talks about employability skills. Once again, thankfully, the federal government has not attempted to define what employability skills are. However, what they're talking about here are, sometimes you might hear them called soft skills, transportable skills, professional skills, a variety of different names. But what they're talking about are things like critical thinking, communicating, problem solving. We've got ample data from CEOs around the country that when they hire folks, when they're looking to promote folks, they're not looking at the mastery of the technical skill. They want to know that you can work together as part of a team, that you can problem solve together, that you're going to show up on time. Those are really key factors for them. And so now you have to include employability skills. Again, this is great for Project Lead the Way because this is something that we really bake into the content. But I really think this will be very, very good for kids as more states move in this direction of including employability skills. 2 quickies here. In the past, in-demand industry sectors or occupations, the law talks about you've got to have programs of study that prepare students for in-demand industry sectors or occupations. You don't want to incentivize states or districts preparing kids for, to be bookkeepers when really what you need are people who can manage Excel files. I mean, those are 2 different skill sets. And so you talk about you need to show alignment with in-demand. The nice thing about Perkins 5 is that this can now include future potential sectors. And the example I always give here is, imagine if you're one of those communities who a couple years ago you were awarded one of the new Amazon warehouses. That I've seen some of these are amazing. You'll have whole areas that humans are not allowed because they've got robots moving around these pallets and everything. It's incredible. So you're a community that now is going to have thousands of jobs related to this new warehouse. Under Perkins 4, you could not change your programs of study to prepare students for that warehouse that will open in 2 years because those jobs are not yet available. That's the way the law was written. So Perkins V is smart and says, well, if you can show the jobs are going to be available in the near future, you can go ahead and start preparing students now, which is just smart. And then the last thing here is it talks, funds may go toward work-based learning, which is huge. Turns out this might be very more relevant than folks anticipated, but the law was written to say that work-based learning could include simulated work environments. So if you're maybe a small rural school, or you're working with an industry partner and you're able to replicate some aspects of the industry in your school building, you can still count that as a work-based learning setting, even if it's simulated. As I mentioned, it might be likely that this becomes even more frequent, if not long-term, at least in the year ahead, as there will likely be fewer instances of in-person opportunities for students to go into a factory or an industry in the morning and then return to the school in the afternoon. That will be harder with some of the restrictions we will likely see. So all in all, a very good law, lots of great opportunities. I'm not going to say a lot here. Hopefully that was informative. What I'm going to show you now, just a couple slides of, okay, great, Will. Fully understand the law. That makes sense. I've said it a number of times. There are state plans and there are district plans that flesh out a lot of the details. I want to know what my district is saying. I want to know what my state is saying. Okay, let's talk about how you can learn that. Really, I'm actually not going to spend very much time on this slide at all. So essentially, I mentioned this, that states submit plans to the federal government approves those plans, and then the state asks districts to submit a plan up to the state, which the state approves. In terms of timeline, where we are with the law, again, not a lot here. We are in spring of 2020, states submitting a 4-year plan to the federal government for approval. Let's draw that out a little bit. Spring, summer, fall. So we're in summer of 2020. You see my April 15th deadline over here. States submitted a 4-year plan. The law required those to be submitted by 4/15 of 2020. However, that was changed to accommodate COVID-19 interruptions. But at this point, and you see my check mark here, all 50 states have submitted their future plans. These plans will cover school years, the current school year plus 3 more, to the Department of Education, and all 50 have been approved. So that's good news for everybody on the call, because that means you can go out and you can find your state's 4-year plan and you can read about how it's doing programs of study, what courses they're going to approve, how you're going to be held accountable, etc. A lot of good detail. So I'm going to skip this. So how can you find your state plan? This is what I just said. These are all the details that exist in a state plan. Programs of study, how academic, technical, and employability skills will be included, size, scope, and quality requirements for local CTE, et cetera, et cetera. So read your plans. Where can you get them? This is where. So over here on the right side of the screen, you see a pretty straightforward, simple web address, cte.ed.gov. This will take you to the Perkins Collaborative Resource Network. One-stop shop, one of the better .gov websites you will ever come across. So I highly recommend you spend some time and check this out. And you'll see here, this is a screenshot. This is actually a couple weeks old, actually a couple months old. You still see the due date. But you'll go to the website and you'll see a tab for state profiles. Certainly poke around, play around. If you want to find the full law, it's linked here as well. Lots of really good updates. But come to this site, click on state profiles, and you'll get to a page that looks like this. And you can see that I've selected Indiana from the drop-down menu. All the states are there. So you select your state and you'll see this landing page. You will see the total amount the state is going to receive for the current fiscal year. You see a couple other headings here, all very informative stuff. You can get past data around how many students are enrolled in CTE. You can get past performance data. And oftentimes this is broken down by race, gender, etc. So how well did females perform, CTE concentrating females perform on state exams? Some really great data. And then also over here on the right, you see CTE contacts. So here you can find the name of the state director and the name of the person responsible for the state plan. So I talked about, you want to advocate for yourself, you got questions, go to this website and you can find the person in the State Department who is an expert on this issue and shoot them an email. Like I said earlier, I used to work in state departments of ed. Never feel bad about reaching out to your State Department of Ed. Sometimes they might act like they're frustrated. If they do, remind them that they work for you. Their job is to help you. But frequently they will be happy to hear from a teacher and to have that conversation. And so if you go to data downloads, if you go to that tab, I'm going to show you what that looks like. So here we are in the data downloads, and you see there are several categories, but the very top one will be the Perkins V plan. These things, they vary between 50 pages to 120 pages. Some of it you can skip. But truly, if you really are interested in knowing more about how this works in your building, how this works in your state, what opportunities exist for you, if it's not clear to you what your district is doing, if you want to be involved in the conversation, come here, download your state's plan, print it out. I keep them on my iPad. Pour yourself a glass of wine, after hours when you're not in the building, and spend some time with this plan. And if you haven't ever done that, it really will be eye-opening. So I really encourage that you do that. Okay, so that's the presentation with all of the content. Now I want to pivot and talk about, obviously things might be different. What's that going to look like? Certainly challenges in all facets of what school will look like come the 2021 school year. CTE is no exception. So let's talk about how Perkins V is being administered as we work through this. So first, and you all may have seen this, at the end of the 1920 school year, very quickly we saw all 50 states close schools either entirely or move all learning to online. Students were not allowed into buildings. The federal government, through the CARES Act, the stimulus fund legislation that was passed and pumped a bunch of money in for unemployment, et cetera, included a policy provision that gave the Secretary of Education the authority to waive certain federal requirements. And this authority was exercised, and many requirements for 1920 were waived. So for example, the federal government did not require that states assess students. They also, I mentioned this earlier, the deadline for state plans had been April 15th. That deadline was pushed, but also some of the data reporting requirements were changed to make sure that no one was legally on the hook for something that they weren't able to complete at the end of 1920. One of the very interesting things, and you might have seen this, it was a beautiful story that a lot of teachers and students, maybe they had taken the 3D printer home, maybe they recognized that, look, we've got a closet full of PPE, face masks, face shields, gloves. And as you all know, there was a pinch for those materials. The federal government did come out and issue guidance saying, yeah, you can donate equipment that was purchased with federal funds to healthcare workers. Smart move, right move, great inspiring stuff to see. I hope you all saw it, the students and teachers who were 3D printing face masks and stuff like that. Really inspiring stuff, demonstrating how relevant all of this is. If you're involved in these conversations, if you're involved with approving donations or want to make that happen, you need to check out the federal guidance and the federal regulations. The feds did not just say, yeah, give it to whomever you want and don't worry about it. There are some really tight requirements in terms of reporting, where it went, who you gave it to, how much you gave away, etc. So this was the right move, but if you're involved with this, certainly look at the federal FAQ. It's available on ed.gov's website. Very, very important that you do that. They have some other FAQs. One of the things they've clarified is that as state and district plans are being developed, I emphasized that you have to consult with stakeholders. They emphasize that that does not need to occur in person. So much like we're doing now, states can have virtual town halls via email, et cetera, to get that feedback if they're not able to meet in person. Very interestingly, keep an eye on this. So I mentioned that the CARES Act gave the Secretary of Education the authority to waive all sorts of federal requirements, not just related to Perkins, but also related to the Every Student Succeeds Act. We saw the biggie that most people paid attention to was the flexibility related to assessments, end of course assessments, but we also saw some flexibility around when you can spend money. There are some percentage caps, et cetera, and all of that was waived for the 1920 school year. But very important to note here that this authority has not been granted for the 2021 school year. That might change, but as we sit here today, the Secretary of Education does not have the authority to waive these requirements for the 2021 school year. So all federal requirements, reporting requirements, assessment requirements, as of now, are still required. So keep an eye on that as it might change. And then interestingly, and again, I recommend if you're involved in these conversations at a high level, check out what .ed.gov has to say. But it seems like OCTAE, which is the office that manages Perkins approval, seems to be suggesting that, look, if the Secretary of Ed is not given this power, we might have some ability to allow you to resubmit a plan based on what you're able to do. And they're talking between the lines a little bit. They don't want to signal anything too clearly if they don't have to, but it gives me the sense that they're seeking some flexibility for themselves. So with that, I will flip it over to the Q&A again and see what I can answer. All right, so Danielle, you kicked us off with a great question. What is the best way as a teacher to justify spending Perkins funds on resources like PLTW and Solid Professor to our administrators? Hopefully, some of that came out as I talked through this, emphasizing the ways in which PLTW fits so neatly into the requirements of Perkins V. And I'll tell you, I've seen states and districts struggle with concepts like, how do we include employability skills into our traditional CTE courses that we've been teaching for 10 years? Well, PLTW can do it. How do we ensure that we're assessing students in a meaningful way? PLTW's got that baked in. How can we ensure that we're aligned with in-demand jobs? Well, computer science, cybersecurity, PLTW's got that covered. So hopefully those are the leading points, and it's a great question that help you justify using PLTW. But then the second thing I'd say is, look, schools and districts and states are on the hook to see results, that the results are being measured. And if you want to see those results be positive, if you want to see CTE students graduate, if you want to see them succeed on end of course exams, I mean, PLTW, if you go to our website, we've got research that shows students do well on those things when they are engaged with Project Lead the Way curriculum. So on the one hand, you can say PLTW will help you comply with the most meaningful aspects of the law. And then on the other hand, you can say, PLTW can help make sure that we are succeeding with the students who are benefiting from these funds. So hopefully it's both and, but it's a great question. And I love that you're thinking that. Let's see. So interesting question here, again from Christopher. Perkins money is often subjected to more requirements by state level education departments. You are right, and those are the plans that I'm talking about. If you want to know what those requirements are, your best place to start is to look at the state plan and understand what that looks like. Your second question is, how do we raise the money for various elements of PLTW and other CTE curricula, especially consumables? That's a great question. My first response would be to look at those other funding streams, either coming from the state or coming from your district, depending on what state you're in and how all that works, to see if there's budget available there. And hopefully there is. And one of the things I frequently point people in the direction of is for teachers, CTE, Title II through ESSA applies to all teachers. And Title II is how another source of professional development and learning for teachers. And so there's an opportunity to supplement CTE professional development through Title II. There are also opportunities through other title spending to supplement, not supplant, for those of you who are really listening closely, additional consumables that might be needed. But primarily, I would say, before you get to the idea of raising money, to look at those other sources of CTE funding through the state or through the district. Outside of that, of course, I'd plug some of the grant opportunities that PLTW has available, where you might be eligible to receive a grant from PLTW. And then, yeah, and so I'll leave it at that. So hopefully you don't have to raise too much money. And when you say raise, I'm thinking of fundraisers. Hopefully that you don't have a huge need for that. Hopefully there is money available through some of those other channels. I think that those are all the ones I see. And let me double check. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any. Hopefully this was a good use of your time. As I said at the top, the objective was to make sure that in general, you have a better understanding of how the federal law works. Hopefully we've met that objective. The big idea is that you have that more thorough understanding for the sake of advocating for yourself, for your students, for your programs, and for your school. Hopefully you feel equipped to do some of that. And certainly, hopefully, you feel motivated to do that. We're in challenging times. I tell my team frequently that, look, CTE is more important than ever right now. The ability to teach students what learning might look like in the future and equip them with a broad set of skills so that they can relearn and be successful regardless of what the world throws at them is, I mean, we're seeing how relevant that mission is. So thank you for the work that you all do in educating students at whatever level it is you do so. My contact information is here. Please feel free to shoot me an email, give me a follow on Twitter. And if there are some additional questions, I will always do my best to answer those for you. Thanks and have a good rest of your conference.